Don't worry, there's enough.
Well, on Crimea, actually, the Russians are united, including me. I think it was right to take Crimea. Well, regardless of the consequences, Crimea is as Russian as Texas is American. So, just to be clear on that, Eastern Ukraine is another thing. Is the first matter with domestic policies. Yes, frankly, I didn't vote. I voted for him.
Boy, that was a long
No, I
time.
think we should do it. But on Crimea, I support him.
Well, you have a lot of companies.
I have a company of 145 million Russian citizens, maybe minus a few million. But actually, that's very strong consensus in Russia. And if America believes that sanctions break this consensus, you're wrong. On Crimea, Ukraine is another issue.
You live in the district?
That's why I got my point. Exactly. No, it was a revelation when I moved to Virginia.
You have to make this point.
What was I really paying
You
for?
have the power, yeah. You have.
Nor do we have the inclination. Okay, guys. Okay, I think we're gonna get started here, guys. All right.
Yeah. Anytime.
Yep, I think we'll work our way to the stage. Matthew, did you get?
All right. Yeah.
Thanks. Thanks.
Yeah,
Make sure you got as much as we got.
I appreciate it very much.
Good. No problem. Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Will Pomerantz, Deputy Director of the Kennan Institute, and welcome to our seminar. A few administrative matters to take care of before we get started. Upcoming events, this coming Monday at 10:30, we will have Oana Serafim talking about the recent Moldovan parliamentary elections, giving us an update of what occurred. And then next Wednesday, on December 10th, the Kennan Institute will be co-sponsoring an event at the National Endowment for Democracy on the Maidan 1 year later, the changing face of politics in Ukraine. It's Wednesday, December 10th from 8:30 to 9:30. And double check your email because we sent out a correction, but it's on December 10th. And it is off-site, so if you come here, you will be terribly disappointed, although the net is not that far away. Well, it's this morning, it's our great pleasure to have our panelists here to discuss developments in the Russian Far East. I'd like to thank the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia for co-sponsoring today's event, as well as the Asian program here at the Wilson Center. We're going to hear from two speakers first, Rensley and Artyom Lukin, and then we're going to have commentary by Matthew Ouimet from the U.S. State Department. I'll run through the introductions right now so that we can carry through as fast as possible. But Rensley will be speaking first, and he is a senior fellow of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. He has been a consultant to numerous U.S. government agencies and a recipient of many grants from the U.S. Institute of Peace, as well, I should add, as a short-term scholar here at the Kennan Institute. He has published widely, and he received his PhD in political science and history from Stanford University. That will be followed by Artyom Lukin, who is Director for Research at the School of Regional and International Studies at Far Eastern Federal University in Vladivostok. He is an Associate Professor at the Department of International Relations. He holds a PhD in Political Science from the International Relations from the Far Eastern National University. He's the author of 50 scholarly publications, and I'm so pleased that Artyom and Renz are here today to discuss their upcoming publication and book on the Far East. Finally, we'll have some commentary from Matthew Ouimet after the two presentations. Matthew is at the U.S. Department of State, where he is a senior analyst of Russian foreign policy. He is also formerly a public policy scholar here at the Wilson Center, and we had the great pleasure of having him here a couple years ago. He is the author of The Rise and Fall of the Brezhnev Doctrine in Soviet Foreign Policy. He also received his PhD from the University of Washington. So we really have real expertise on a region that is often under-discussed here in Washington. So I look forward to the presentations and the commentary, and we'll start with
Okay,
Renz.
well, thank you very much, Will. I think I'd like to start by making a few introductory remarks about the Russian Far East, sort of what it is, sort of where it stands strategically in international relations in Asia. Let's start by saying that the Russian Far East, what is it? Well, it includes the 9 easternmost provinces of the Russian Federation, and I think it's a place that holds very special significance for international relations in Northeast Asia and the Western Pacific. The Russian Far East has several commanding attributes. First of all, it's a very big place. It's Russia's largest region. It encompasses 36% of the national territory, equivalent to about 2/3 the size of the United States. Second, it's a very rich place. It's rich in almost every conceivable variety of natural resource: oil, natural gas, major metals, coal, timber, fish stocks, uncontaminated land. And these are resources which are in relatively short supply among Russia's Asian neighbors. Third, the RFE has a very unique geography, and this, I think, is one of the most important aspects of this territory. It's sandwiched between China, Japan, the United States, and the Koreas. It fronts on both the North Pacific and the Arctic Ocean. And this makes it a volatile arena of conflicting forces and interests, and a potential focal point of geopolitical competition in the new century. Now, despite the Russian Far East size, resources, strategic location, it's also a very troubled place. Remote from Russia's European core, it is economically, demographically challenged. It's losing population even as we speak, and it has been a constant concern for Moscow over the years. With 36% of the national territory, the Russian Far East includes just 4% of the country's population and about the same percentage of Russia's national GDP. And among the additional attractions of the place, it includes Russia's coldest winter climate, the lowest population density, the lowest life expectancy, the least developed social infrastructure, and the highest homicide rate of any Russian region. So this is a place that has obviously big potential, but also very big problems. Now, in recent years, Moscow has come to realize that the isolation, general backwardness of the Russian Far East is really a security threat. It's a threat to the security and integrity of the Russian nation. And it has made development of the RFE a top national priority for the 21st century. Now, how and this I think is very important, how Moscow manages this very difficult task is going to have very broad implications, not just for Russia, but for international relations and the balance of economic and political forces in East Asia generally. Okay. Now, let me sketch out the main outlines of my argument, which I think is also our argument here. Russia doesn't have anywhere near the resources to accomplish a task of this magnitude on its own. And this is especially true in the current economic environment. I mean, the economy is tipping into recession. The ruble is plummeting. Value of the ruble. Oil prices are heading south, and so on and so on and so forth. Russia's facing big economic problems, and what this means is that Russia is going to need outside help, a lot of outside help, in order to be able to modernize the Russian Far East and uplift it to the level of the rest of Russia, which is what really the leadership wants to do. But where is this outside help going to come from? Now, traditionally, the RFE has relied heavily on project financing, on capital investment, on money from Eurozone countries, from Japan, and also to some extent from the United States. But the West's economic disengagement from Russia in the wake of the Ukraine crisis has, to some extent, to a large extent, limited or foreclosed these options. Now, if the West remains wedded to its sanctions policy, Russia is going to have to rely increasingly on China to bankroll its development ambitions in eastern Siberia and the Russian Far East. And we believe that this plays into a broader Chinese strategic vision, which is to link China's northeast provinces and Russia's eastern provinces into a common integrated economic zone. And these are the words of China's Vice President Li Yuanzhao in the speech that he made, I think, earlier this year. And since China's northeast has 11 times the GDP and 17 times the population of the Russian Far East, it's not hard to see that integration would very likely occur on terms dictated by the PRC. A strong and controlling Chinese influence in a region that is strategically vital, as important as the RFE, I think could alter power arrangements in the Asia-Pacific theater to China's advantage. Now, we don't see this as an inevitable outcome, but we certainly see the need for a deliberate, a concerted Western policy of engagement to balance China's growing influence and reach in the region. Now, let me shift gears and talk a little bit about the United States. Where does the United States fit in to all of this discussion? Sort of a rule of thumb in the U.S.-Russia relationship is that relations in the West tend to be confrontational, antagonistic. And of course, the quintessential example is the current crisis occurring in the Ukraine. But relations in the East, relations in the Pacific, that is, tend to be fairly tranquil and trouble-free. This is a bit of an oversimplification, but I think it holds pretty well looking back in time also. And I think if you do look at the history of things, you'll see that there has been sort of periods, important periods of collaboration based on geographical proximity, a shared Pacific space, and some common security concerns. In the 19th century, the common enemy was who? Was Great Britain, which was the international bad guy of that era. The sale of Alaska, in fact, had quite a bit to do with the fear of both countries, both the United States and Russia, that Britain might somehow gain control of this valuable and rich piece of real estate, Alaska, okay? The early 20th century, the enemy was Imperial Japan, which at the time harbored ambitions of creating a Russian client state stretching all the way from the shores of the Pacific up to and including Lake Baikal. In the 1940s, it was the Lend-Lease supply train that was destined, of course, for the Russian front. And part of that supply train, almost half of it, actually passed through the Russian Far East, largely through the port of Vladivostok. In the early post-Soviet period, Washington deemed the Russian Far East to be especially vitally important for Russia's transition from communism to to democracy and a market-based economy. Actually, at the time, the Russian Far East was a line item in the 1992 Freedom Support Act, and the Freedom Support Act gave birth to a number of economic assistance and business development programs that were designed largely or entirely to benefit the Russian Far East. But by the second decade of the new millennium, these programs had mostly petered out. Conditions in Russia, of course, had changed, and Russia was now putting its own funds into development of the Russian Far East. And in general, Washington and Moscow were disengaging this period. Pacific Russia was no longer much of an item, didn't receive much attention in Washington's economic and security calculations. Now, this seemed evident in a 2011 article by then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton entitled, quote, "America's Pacific Century," unquote, which provided context or background for the Obama administration's pivot to Asia in the following year. Now, this article called for reaching out to and building relations with every conceivable Asia-Pacific country, just about, but managed to omit Russia. And Russia being a country with 15,000 miles of Pacific coastline that occupies the geographic and strategic heartland of Northeast Asia. Now, today, and this is sort of where we are right now, the Russian Far East is no longer considered special. It is just like any other part of Russia, subject to broad Western economic sanctions. And this is sort of where we start. We believe in Russian Far East exceptionalism. We don't believe that it's just like any other part of Russia. And we see its geopolitical significance as growing as U.S.-China relations, rather U.S.-China rivalry, increasingly defines the context of international relations in East Asia and the Western Pacific. Perhaps it's time to think in terms of revitalizing or resuscitating the special relationship and redefining it in strategic terms that are understandable to both Moscow and Washington. Thank you very much.
Artyom.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, could we dim the lights a little bit so the map is... Okay, thank you again for inviting me and Rans to speak here. As Rans said in his introductory speech, the Russian Far East remains both an asset and liability for Russia, Ever since Russia acquired these territories east of Lake Baikal, there have been constant worries that they are at the risk of being lost. And most recently, these worries were acutely felt back in the 1990s, when the Russian state seemed close to collapse and the Far East was all but abandoned by Moscow. Yet, under the Putin administration, Moscow reasserted control over the regions, over the provinces, including the Russian Far East. And more than that, with regard to the Russian Far East, Moscow initiated a whole array of measures and policies to significantly accelerate the development of the region. And as Rans mentioned, the Russian Far East was proclaimed one of Russia's top national priorities for the 21st century. And there has been a massive outpour of state-funded large-scale investments to upgrade the Russian Far East infrastructure. And if you come to Vladivostok, and you are all invited, you will see for yourself the results of this renovation. Yet, I have to say that the results of Moscow's strategy to invigorate the Russian Far East and advance economic interaction with Asia have been decidedly mixed. Of course, things are now much better in the Russian Far East than they used to be just a decade ago. But by 2013, the region's economic growth largely petered out, along with Russia's. And of course, this was recently compounded by the distraction of the Kremlin's attention and resources because of the Ukraine crisis. Add to that the falling oil prices. And the economic outlook for the Russian Far East is very uncertain right now. The government and businesses are facing mounting financial constraints, which threaten the feasibility of previously approved plans for the region's development. And private foreign companies are still in no hurry to set up shop in the Russian Far East, despite Moscow's efforts to attract foreign investors. Turning to China. As Rans already said, the Russian Far East has historically had quite an ambivalent relationship with its giant neighbor. China is seen as an indispensable economic partner, but at the same time, China is a source of perceived threat. After all, the southern part of what is now the Russian Far East used to be under the Qing's dynasty nominal sovereignty until the latter part of the 19th century. And here on this slide, you can see a Soviet era monument in Blagoveshchensk. This is a major Russian city on the Amur River. And this is one of the most popular landmarks in Blagoveshchensk. And it says the Amur land was, is, and will be Russian. And of course, this message is addressed to our neighbor, China. Because in China, many people still believe that the Russian Far East is not actually Russia's, but China's, even though, as you probably know, legally China recognizes the sovereignty of Russia over the Russian Far East. But in fact, there are lingering concerns in Russia that China may sooner or later reclaim these lands. But today, as of course you know, Moscow and Beijing are close strategic partners, and the relationship, I think, the relationship increasingly resembles a quasi-alliance. And I actually think that this picture is wrong. This is the way many Western observers portray Sino-Russian relationship right now, as fraught with mutual suspicions, as inherently fragile and bound to break up. It may be true, partially, but the current events, they just don't don't prove it. We see that the relationship is only growing stronger. And this tendency is quite long-standing. So the partnership was established in the mid-1990s, and since that time, it has only grown stronger and stronger. And I can see no reason whatsoever to believe that the relationship will break down anytime soon, at least not in the next decade. And I think one major reason China needs a strong bond with Russia lies in the Russian Far East. And by the way, this is the picture of Xi Jinping, at the time Vice President of the PRC, who visited Vladivostok in March 2010. China, as I think, is increasingly interested in the Russian Far East for two major reasons. First, Beijing wants to have a secure and peaceful northern border with Russia so that it can concentrate its military resources and planning on other strategic theaters, above all, the Western Pacific. Second, China's voracious economy needs the Arab East natural resources, which makes sense not only economically, but at least as much strategically. And China, I think, begins to see Eastern Russia and the Russian Far East as an important strategic area, a reliable backyard, as one Chinese scholar said, a proximate overland supply of a range of vital primary commodities. And this is directly related to China's intensifying contest with the US for primacy in the Asia-Pacific. And Beijing, as you're probably aware of, is increasingly worried that if this rivalry with the US comes to a head, Washington may use its trump card, launching a naval blockade of the sea lanes through which China receives most of its imported primary products. Of course, this statement may seem a little bit far-fetched right now, especially after President Obama and Xi Jinping shook hands in Beijing and looked very friendly with each other. But I think Chinese strategists, they're quite seriously considering such scenarios, that if there is a conflict, a clash between China and Russia, between China and the US, then the US could just sever off China's maritime lanes of communication. It will impose embargo on China, or maybe economic sanctions, just as the US is trying to do with Russia right now. There are indications that Beijing is attaching much greater priority to the Russian Far East than was the case just 5 or 10 years ago. In the 1990s and in the 2000s, Chinese economic presence in the Russian Far East, it was there, but it was quite limited, quite restricted. Trade was mostly with the northeastern China, Heilongjiang province, very little Chinese investment, little participation in upstream sectors, and even Chinese migration. There is a myth that there are a lot of Chinese lurking in the Russian Far East, but it's simply not true, at least now. At most, there are currently 300,000 Chinese people, at most, in the Russian Far East, and most of them are sojourners, short-term visitors, rather than permanent residents. This is how matters stand right now, but they may change. I think that China's footprint in the Russian Far East is about to grow substantially. So we see that big Chinese players are coming to the Russian Far East, and there are several reasons for this. Number one, Moscow is now willing to let the Chinese into the sectors of Eastern Russia's economy that were previously off limits to China, just because Moscow was wary of China's intentions. And of course, the Western sanctions are the second reason. Moscow now has basically no alternatives for getting foreign investment apart from China. So we are now seeing a number of very big deals being made between Russia and China, and many of them are focused on the Russian Far East. For example, this natural gas mega deal that was recently concluded between Gazprom and CNPC. There are also other examples, such as Russia agreeing to give China a stake in a huge oil field in eastern Siberia, Russia agreeing to give Russia a stake in Udakan copper field in Zabaikalia region, and so on and so forth. So definitely the picture is changing in very significant ways. And I would like to say that the Russian Far East is just one piece in China's long-term geopolitical game, aimed at creating zones of influence along its continental frontiers. And two other major areas where Beijing pursues similar goals of securing its borders, getting preferential access to rich natural resources, and even probably gaining a degree of political influence are continental Southeast Asia and Central Asia. So incidentally, the Russian Far East, Central Asia, and continental Southeast Asia, or Indochina, they are all areas where China in the past held sovereignty or suzerainty, at least in large parts of these regions. And Beijing, as we see, it tries to bind these areas up as much as possible with its contiguous provinces. For example, the Russian Far East is being partnered with Heilongjiang province and northeastern China. Central Asia is being attached to Xinjiang, western China, while Indochina or continental Southeast Asia has Yunnan province as its main partner, and this is a deliberate policy by Beijing. So again, we are seeing indications that China is moving into the Russian Far East, this time in very serious ways. But of course, Moscow, on the one hand, Moscow is making efforts to court Chinese investments, but on the other hand, Moscow is a little bit nervous. And Russia understands that it's perhaps inevitable that China will be the #1 external player in the Russian Far East. But Russia is extremely interested in balancing the growing Chinese presence in the Russian Far East by other Asia-Pacific actors. By the way, this is my own credit card. This is another element of China's growing presence in Russia and the Russian Far East, this time in the financial sector. So nowadays, and it happened quite recently, it's possible to get credit cards from the UnionPay network, which is of course China's banking network, alternative to MasterCard and Visa. And this card, which is here. I hold it close to my heart, actually. This one is distributed by Gazprom Bank, which is, of course, under Western sanctions. Just a year ago, it was impossible to get UnionPay cards via major Russian banks. Now it's possible. I did it for research purposes. Just a couple of weeks ago, I just went to Gazprom Bank, and they were happy to provide me with this UnionPay card. And I like this nice picture of Chinese dragon. Well,
Subtle.
Okay, so how about other Asia-Pacific alternatives to China for the Russian Far East? Of course, Japan and Korea. As you can see on this map, Japan and Korea right now, at least until recently, they are almost as much important as China economically for the Russian Far East. In fact, China, Japan, and Korea, by trade volumes, they rank quite close to each other. And in terms of investments in the Russian Far East, Japan and Korea even significantly outdid China, at least until recently. And no doubt, Japan and Korea will continue to be important players in the Russian Far East, but I think they will not by themselves be able to counterbalance China economically for a number of reasons. And I think the most important one, the economic weight, Japan's and Korea's, is just not commensurate with China's. And of course, there are other reasons as well. So I think this is where the US could step in. So a few words on Russia-US relationship, the Trans-Pacific relationship. And in fact, this is the picture where you can see that Sarah Palin was actually right when she said that she could see Russia from her backyard. The bigger island is Russia's, Big Diomede Island, and the smaller one is America's island. And they are just 2 miles apart in the Bering Strait, so we are actually, Russia and the US are actually neighbors in the North Pacific, whether you like it or not, but we are neighbors. But nevertheless, unfortunately, the US does not have much economic presence in the Russian Far East. Currently, again, for a number of reasons, actually there is no pressing need for America to get involved economically with the Russian Far East because America has its own natural resources, especially with this shale oil and gas revolution. And I think economically, maybe the US is not so much interested in the Russian Far East, but I think from a geopolitical perspective, the Russian Far East significance for America is only growing. As I said, China is most likely going to treat the Russian Far East as a strategic area, and I don't think that America should be interested in the Russian Far East being turned into such a reliable strategic backyard for China. This is one reason I think the US should be interested in the Russian Far East. And I think another interesting thing is that the US and Russia, they do not have serious disagreements when it comes to the Asia Pacific. Of course, we have huge problems in Eastern Europe, in the post-Soviet space. But in the Asia Pacific, our interests, they largely concur. And neither Washington nor Moscow wish to see a China-dominated Asia. And this eventually, maybe not right now, but eventually may form the basis for Russian-American strategic dialogue in the Asia Pacific, including on the issues concerning the RFE. And as Rance mentioned, Russia and the US already had a successful record of strategic collaboration in the Asia Pacific, and it's partially thanks to the US that the Russian Far East is still Russian, because it's partly due to American diplomatic pressure that Japan pulled out its troops from the Russian Far East back in the 1920s from Vladivostok. And so we are thankful to America for that, still thankful. Although we understand that America did it at that time not for Russia's sake, but for its own geopolitical sake. So maybe this scenario could be repeated. And of course, despite the heated rhetoric, which prevails on both sides right now, I genuinely think that there is a chance for accommodation. President Putin, even when he lashes out at American, as he calls it, unilateral diktat, I think Putin seems to obliquely, at least, propose a compromise with the West. If you read his statements carefully, in all of his statements concerning the US, he holds out this possibility of a compromise. And I believe that if Russia and the US and, of course, European countries, if they manage to reach some settlement in Eastern Europe, this will open the way for Russian-American dialogue in the Asia-Pacific. Of course, it would be unreasonable to expect that Russia would agree to take part in containing China. It would never happen unless, of course, Russia feels direct and immediate threat from China. However, Russia can be a major independent player in the Asia-Pacific, thus contributing to a stable balance of power and posing a counterweight to potential bids for regional hegemony. And this is the political role Moscow Moscow aspires to in the Asia-Pacific, and I think this role, this potential role, is fully compatible with American national interests. And this brings us back to the Russian Far East. For Russia cannot be a meaningful player in the Asia-Pacific unless its Far East is stable and economically successful and well integrated with the Asia-Pacific economic community. And conversely, the Russian Far East, which is in economic distress and dysfunctional, will become a soft target for an expansionist China. And of course, we cannot exclude scenarios when China gets increasingly nationalistic and expansionist, and after it gets Taiwan and the South China Sea, of course, it can turn its gaze to the Russian Far East. It will not happen now, it will not happen in the near future, but it may happen. Therefore, I believe that America needs the Russian Far East, which is sustainable, prosperous, and remains under full Russia's sovereignty. And what are the potential roles for the US in the Russian Far East? Again, presently, America's economic presence in the Russian Far East is negligible, apart maybe from Exxon's oil and gas projects on the Sakhalin Island. But there are some sectors, some niches where America can be indispensable in the Russian Far East. Of course, America cannot compete with China in terms of the volume of cash infusions. No one can compete with China in this respect nowadays. But I think where America is indispensable is in the fields of advanced technologies, in the fields of expertise, in the fields of sustainable development. After all, America has Alaska, which is very close to Russia in terms of not only geographically, but also in terms of climatic conditions, natural resource endowment, and so on. And I think the main goal of the US with regard to the Russian Far East should be not to keep China out of the Russian Far East, which is neither possible nor desirable, but America and its friends and allies in the Asia-Pacific should work to enable the Russian Far East to integrate with Asia-Pacific economies so that China does not become the predominant player in the region, and Russia would definitely welcome such a strategy. Okay, and I think the concluding part of my presentation will have to do with scenarios. Actually, I love drawing up various scenarios, alternative futures, and here I and Rance, we tried to kind of to imagine 5 basic scenarios which could play out for the next 10-15 years with regard to the Russian Far East. And the first one is kind of kind of pessimistic. This scenario is based on the recent trends. Russia is moving ever closer to China strategically, and China increases its presence in the Russian Far East. It becomes the dominant economic force in the Russian Far East, gains direct or indirect control over the region's key assets. And by the way, control over the Russian Far East and Eastern Siberia gives also gives China command over Mongolia, making Mongolia basically an enclave within China's zone of geoeconomic influence. And there is a probability that China's exclusive economic penetration of the Russian Far East would eventually be followed by a rising degree of geopolitical control, ultimately jeopardizing Russian sovereignty and threatening to turn the Russian Far East not just into a raw material appendix, but also a military strategic base for China in the North Pacific. And remember the previous picture, the Russian Far East is just miles away from Alaska. So do Americans want Chinese military bases across the Bering Strait? This is the question for American strategists to ponder. Of course, it's not going to happen anytime soon, but it's a long-term possibility. And of course, this scenario will see the Russian Far East become a kind of outer Manchuria, where principal decisions about the Russian Far East, well, it may not be Russian anymore, but anyway, principal decisions are made not in Moscow and Vladivostok, but in Beijing and Harbin. So the second scenario is the Russian Far East as a backwater. So this scenario essentially reverts the Russian Far East to the situation of the 90s and 2000s, early 2000s, when there was not much interest in the Russian Far East, neither from Moscow nor from China and other countries. This future could materialize if, for example, China's economic growth founders, leading to the decline in demand for the Russian Far East's commodities. And the next one, the Russian Far East as an area for international economic cooperation and integration. Of course, this is the best case scenario, which is premised on an economically dynamic Russia, which maintains healthy relations both with China and the West, and successfully integrates with the Asia Pacific. The third one, the fourth one, is what I call Fortress Russia and Fortress RFE, which means that Russia goes into self-isolation, reduces contacts with the outside world to bare minimum, including with China. And of course, the Russian Far East, its insulation will be made by Moscow even more complete, just because the Russian Far East is deemed more vulnerable compared to other Russian regions in the core of the country. And this scenario can become realistic if Russia has adversarial relations, both with the West and China, which is also possible. And finally, what I call wildcard scenarios. Those are extreme scenarios which may not seem very probable right now, but cannot be excluded. And perhaps the most prominent among them is China attempting to annex the Russian Far East by something like a surprise invasion. Of course, this is not to say that such an aggression is imminent or likely. However, it cannot be ruled out completely. If and when Russia weakens, and particularly if it descends into chaos due to a severe political and economic crisis. So China might be tempted to take advantage of an opportunity if and when it presents itself. And of course, the likelihood of this scenario will be higher if China establishes itself in the dominant economic position in the Russian Far East, and it will be backed up by a strong demographic presence. So I think the final part, recommendations for US policy makers, which Ayn Rand have drawn up. to consider. Actually, the first one, I think it's the most unrealistic, but still I feel obliged to to say a few words. Determine the peer competitor. I think the U.S. Should think hard about its strategic threat priorities. I think it's increasingly doubtful that the U.S. is able to continue its present policy of the dual containment of both Russia in Eastern Europe and the post-Soviet space and China in East Asia. Of course, Washington never says that it's containing Russia or China. Well, possibly you are containing Russia right now, but not China. But with regard to China, never use this word, containing. But let's face the reality. I think the Chinese really believe that the Americans are containing the Chinese. And I think this policy was possible in the 1990s, maybe a decade or 5 years ago, but it's not feasible now. And such a policy is only driving Moscow and Beijing closer together, and this policy of dual containment may wind up inadvertently creating an anti-American Sino-Russian alliance in Eurasia. So basically, the US should identify, I know that this sounds very, very kind of balance of power, very, very rudely, but this is what I generally believe in. The US should identify which one of the two, Russia or China, is the biggest risk to the US. You have to choose at this stage. And then try and reach, at least to some degree, some measure of accommodation with the other one, either with China or Russia. And by almost all measures, material measures, not emotional measures, it is China rather than Russia, which is destined or poised to be America's peer competitor and possibly main geopolitical challenge. However, again, I think it's very unlikely that Washington will change its strategic premises anytime soon. That would require kind of for a revolution in foreign policy thinking, similar to the Nixon embrace of communist China in the early 70s. So let's move to kind of more maybe realistic recommendations. I think China's policy towards the Russian Far East may be an indicator of China's expectations towards the United States. The more pessimistic China is about its relations with the US, the more priority it will give to penetrating Eastern Russia. So the more threatened China feels by the US and by this hypothetical naval blockade, the more it will invest in the Russian Far East. So this is something worth monitoring. Again, number three, I think, again, it may be unrealistic to expect that the Western US-led sanctions against Russia will be lifted anytime soon. We all know that once sanctions are in place, it may take decades to lift them. Just look at Iran or North Korea. However, steps could be taken to at least insulate the activities of the US companies in the Russian Far East from the sanctions. For example, the US government could consider sanctions waivers to American energy and mining companies working in the Russian Far East. Exxon, of course, is very unhappy about its sanctions. And such measures would help keep strategically important American business presence in the Russian Far East and maintain at least some economic alternative to China. And number four, let the Asians do business with the Russian Far East. It's no secret that the US government is mounting a lot of pressure on its Asia-Pacific friends and allies to join anti-Russian sanctions. Asians are resisting. I think only Japan joined sanctions regime so far, and only symbolically. The Japanese, I can tell you, are very unhappy about it. I've talked to my Japanese colleagues, and all of them say that we did it only because of American pressure. We don't like it, but we have to, because America is our big brother. We have to be respectful. And we are afraid of China, and America is our protector, so we have to be in line. But they are very unhappy about that. Korea didn't join, Singapore didn't join, and I think that America should not press Asians to join the sanctions regime. America should let its Asian allies and friends to cooperate with Russia and the Russian Far East, again, because it helps offset China's economic influence in the Russian Far East, just for this only reason. Again, connected to this, I think the US could do a lot to encourage improvement in Japan-Russia relations. Back in the 1950s, as some of you probably know, America helped create a territorial dispute between Moscow and Tokyo over the Kuril Islands. And perhaps now is the time to help Russia and Japan reconcile. Of course, Japan will never reach full normalization with Russia unless America allows it to do it. We understand that. Number 6, I think the US should be more supportive of trilateral trans-Korean projects where Russia, North and South Koreas are involved, such as the Trans-Korean Railway connected to the Trans-Siberian Trans-Korean gas pipeline, which is supplied by Russian gas, electricity grid, which is supplied again by Russia. Currently, the US is tacitly blocking those trilateral projects just because they are deemed to benefit North Korea and benefit Russia. I think it's a mistaken policy, and probably the US should reconsider, because again, those trilateral projects on the Korean Peninsula, they would help Russia diversify away from China. Again, this is more about subnational cooperation, subnational, sub-state diplomacy. As Rance already mentioned, in the 1990s, Russia-US Trans-Pacific cooperation was, to a large extent, driven by subnational cooperation between the US states such as Alaska and Washington and provinces in the Russian Far East. For a number of reasons, this cooperation petered out. I think it's time, it may be time to resuscitate it, to try and resuscitate it. So Washington, the US government could encourage and assist Alaska and Washington, maybe some other states, to expand their links with the Russian Far East. I think it's important. And more on the military strategic side, I think the US should resume inviting Russia to biennial US-led Rim of the Pacific naval exercises. They're held biennially, and in 2012, Russia was for the first time invited to take part in these exercises, which take place off Hawaii. But this year, Russia was not invited, but China was for the first time. So I guess it would be fair and reasonable that both China and Russia should be participants in these exercises. It would help, of course, to promote military-to-military confidence building. And final recommendations. Russia is not a member of the Asian Development Bank, which is the principal multilateral financial institution in the Asia Pacific. And it is not a member because Japan and the United States blocked its application a few years ago. I think it may it may make sense to reconsider and finally admit Russia. Again, ADB could provide the source of alternative financing, alternative to China for the Russian Far East development. And related to these two final recommendations, I think the US could help in establishment of a Northeast Asian Cooperation and Development Financial Institution. This idea has been around for a number of years already, and Japan is interested, Korea is interested, China is interested. I think the US could play a role here as well. Finally, probably the US should consider initiating an informal ad hoc multilateral group consisting of Asia-Pacific nations with an interest in the Russian Far East. I don't think that the US should formally lead this group. Probably Singapore could be a good candidate to lead this group. By the way, Singapore shows some interest in the Russian Far East. There is a active working level relationship between Singapore and the Russian government. So Singaporean businesses are kind of showing some interest in the Russian Far East. And Singapore is viewed as a kind of neutral player, neutral between the United States and China. It has a lot of business acumen. It has a lot of investment capital. So the primary function of the group would be to coordinate the members' moves with respect to economic development of the Russian Far East. I think I have run out of time. Thank you for.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Artyom. Matthew, some
Well,
thoughts.
I want to start by saying it's always a pleasure to come back to the Wilson Center. This is really home for me. I was here twice, once 14 years ago for a year, and once last year for a year. And you know, when I see the receptionist downstairs, I say, I'm home. So it's really great to be here. Thank you for the invitation. I'm also very grateful for the invitation from Rens and Artyom to address their project. Rens was kind enough last year to actually bring me into this project and what they were doing on it at a very early stage, and sort of described it, and we discussed some of their research conclusions and whatnot. So I feel like it's great to see how this is developing and evolving. I should also start off by saying that my opinions are my own. They don't reflect the views of the State Department or the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, where I work. My job here is, very quickly, to offer you some alternate considerations to what Artyom and Rens have suggested. I find a lot of key points here that that frame well the situation that the Russian Far East is facing, and that sound extremely sensible. The potential for separatism in the Russian Far East and the history of it going back to the 1920s is something that many people actually have forgotten about. And the prospect that that could occur again, I think, does loom in Moscow's memory. The demographic challenges that are facing the Russian Far East and Siberia are tremendous right now. The outflow of people from that area in the last 25 years has genuinely endangered the economies there and put them in a situation where people who once opposed immigration now recognize that Asian immigration, guest workers, are needed if this area is to thrive economically. The timing points of Artyom's paper, I think, are very accurate. 2007 was a key turning point. I don't think he mentioned it in his presentation, but he certainly does in his paper. The global economic crisis really woke up the Russians to their dependency on the West and on Western financial systems, and made them recognize that the much more vibrant economies of Asia were an engine of growth that they wanted to hook their little red wagon to and build ties. In fact, in 2009, Foreign Minister Lavrov told a gathering of chiefs of mission at the Russian Foreign Ministry that Russia's national survival depended upon building relations with Asia, and in particular with Asian financial centers, and hooking themselves up to somehow this Asian economic miracle that everyone has spoken so much about. I think that Rents and Artyom do a good job of framing the growing Sino-Russian ties that have developed in the last 20 years. And in fact, Artyom is absolutely right, and it's refreshing to hear him say that this has defied popular Western predictions of looming crisis. It really is something how these ideas have hung on among analysts that there's just going to be, if we just wait long enough, these two countries are going to kill each other. There really is no indication that that's going to happen, you know, in our lifetime. So it's an interesting observation that they make, and I think a very accurate one. The economic dependence of Russia on China in particular is something that is hardly a function of Western sanctions. In fact, it's at least 10 years old. China has been the lender of last resort for Russia since at least 2004, when Rosneft could not find anyone else to loan it money to buy the Slavneft oil operation, and finally had to borrow $6 billion from the Chinese at ridiculously bad terms. But that was the only place they could find money. In 2009, once again, the Chinese loaned Gazprom and Rosneft another $25 billion to complete the Espo pipeline and to pay off the debts that these corporations had found themselves in. Once again, no one else would lend them money because their balance sheets were absolutely horrendous. So the notion that China's entry into Russia's energy sector is growing is true. The notion, however, that it is all dependent or a function of the sanctions is incorrect. In January of 2013, there was a $400 million joint venture that was signed for a power plant in Yaroslavl. Novatek in June 2013 agreed to sell CNPC a 20% share of the Yamal LNG project. Once again, this is because of the need in these companies for someone who would give money to a company that was in relatively poor shape. Fitch downgraded Rosneft from a BBB rating to a BBB minus rating in October of 2013. All these things happened before the problems in Ukraine and the sanctions issues. In terms of Russian foreign policy, Russia is not really a player in Asia. I know it sometimes hurts the Russians to hear this, but really, in terms of influence in Asian institutions, like the East Asia Summit, ASEAN, and APEC, places like this, Russia really leverages its power because of its partnership with the Chinese. If this partnership didn't exist, Russia would have far less influence in Asia than it currently does. So this dependency on China is quite old, at least a decade old, and in fact probably older than that. It is not a function of what's happened since earlier this year. However, it is certainly being intensified as a function of that. We heard a fairly extensive discussion about the notion that China is a threat to Russia, that it would be better off with the U.S. to balance Chinese influence, that a resolution of the Ukraine issue could open the door to Russia's hedging with the United States, that Russian integration with other Asian countries would temper Chinese influence there, and that the U.S. could bring this about and result in greater East Asian support of the Russian Far East. That U.S. encouragement would prompt greater economic engagement of the Russian Far East. That even that China could ultimately retake its lost Siberian territories. So this is all based, I think, on a continuation of this notion that Russia's and China's interests are actually divergent in the long run, rather than complementary. So here's my alternative suggestion. Russia's problems are structural, not political. By that I mean they are not a function of what the United States is doing to them. Their reliance on extractive industries, their failure to invest in those extractive industries, means that Russia lives or dies on the price of natural resources. Russia likes to complain that it doesn't want to become a natural resource appendage to China. The truth is that Russia is a natural resource appendage to the entire world market, because that's what it exports. There is very little that Russia exports that is value added. It is not investing in these sectors. Its failure to modernize its economy, along the lines that former President Medvedev, currently Prime Minister Medvedev, had talked about years ago, have meant that Russia cannot integrate into the Asian economic miracle. Asia is a very unique place. It is the only place on earth where the majority of products that are developed in Asia actually are not developed across their entire supply chain. There is this just-in-time notion in Asia where the entirety of the continent is this big workshop. So, you know, one country makes one piece of a product, it ships it to another country, they make a different piece, and then on to the final resolution of the product, then shipping. This depends upon logistical cooperation that is extremely sophisticated and that Russia simply cannot be part of. In 2012, Russia was ranked 95th out of 155 countries in the World Bank Logistics Performance Index. Its ability to participate in this economic miracle is seriously limited. And as a result, its relationship with Asia is largely dependent on Asians investing in extractive industries, and Russia, once again, being heavily dependent on the price of those resources. And we can see what that has done to Russia recently, entirely separate from the sanctions. It is thought that the sanctions have cost Russia $40 billion this year, and that the falling price of oil has cost them $100 billion. Okay? So the demographic situation that is facing Russia as well means that it needs to open its borders to greater influx of guest workers, and yet it strictly limits the number of guest workers that can come into the Russian Far East and Siberia. German Gref, the head of Sberbank, just yesterday said that Russia has a frightening tendency to think that the world is going to line up to invest its money in Russia, when he pointed out that the competition for financing in the world means that it is Russia that needs to be standing in line for the rest of the world's finances. And he worries that Russian policymakers haven't wrapped their mind around this notion yet. The overdependence on the West, in fact, is precisely what prompted the Russians to build its relations with China more intensively over the last maybe 7 or 8 years. And so the notion that it would actually turn back to the West for greater financial connectivity is basically just going in the opposite direction of where it feels it needs to go. And in fact, I would argue that the current sanctions regimes have only intensified Russia's desire to break free of its dependency on financing from the West. But this means that if it's going to turn to Asian financing, China is really the only game in town. Yes, the Japanese and the Koreans have shown an interest in the Russian Far East, but they are typically very focused on their own projects, whereas China is much more willing to give the kind of money that we talked about as the lender of last resorts. So the last thing I would argue is simply that the reason that Russia and China have managed to build such a cooperative relationship is because their interests do overlap in the long run. Their economies are complementary, and they will remain so largely in the long term. There is little competition on international markets between them for products. There is a little bit that is building now in the munitions industries, but otherwise very little competition. Both want to reform Western-dominated financial systems. Both face outside pressure to abandon authoritarian political systems from other parts of the world. Both face international criticism for the repression of national separatist minorities by the use of force. The Russians in Chechnya, the Chinese in places like Xinjiang and Tibet. So as a result, both have championed the principles of national sovereignty and non-interference over the expansion of democracy. Each, in fact, views democracy as a threat. And in fact, when democratic revolutions break out, they call them color revolutions, and they're convinced that we are driving them all from my office.
And from this office as well.
And from this office as well. And my boss used to have a fantastic response to that. We're just not that good. So the truth is that the two countries, Russia and China, share all of these things together. The United States doesn't share a single one with either one. And as a result, the overlap of interests between the United States and China, or the United States and Russia, I would say, is far less commanding than what I've just outlined between the Russians and the Chinese. So as a result, I really doubt this notion that ultimately China is going to turn on Russia and pull that sickle from out behind the panda's back and take on the bear with the hammer. Because China can have everything it wants from the Russians right now through peaceful means. It can have a peaceful border where, as you point out, it can focus on its issues elsewhere. It can have cooperation in the United Nations. It can have cooperation in the BRICS. It can have a fruitful economic relationship and as much of Russia's resources as it needs. It can send its people there to work on guest worker relationships. All of these things China can have without the invasion that Russia has been fearing for 25 years. I simply don't see it happening, not in my lifetime.
Well, thank you very much, Matthew. We're going to give everyone a chance to answer Matthew's comments, but I think why don't we collect some questions here because we're running out of time. So we'll kind of take some questions, and then we'll give both speakers a chance to comment in response. So we're just going to take some questions because we're pushing time. So short. My one request is that it be a very short question because we are have limited time. 1, 2, and any other hands we can take it. Go ahead.
Yeah, Bill Jones from Executive Intelligence Review. I agree with the idea that the United States should be involved in the Russian Far East, but I disagree with the premises. As I think Mr. Ouimet, if I'm not destroying your name,
Well done.
said, there's no real difference between China and Russia in the long term. They do have a strategic relationship. And my question is that the United States could be involved in that, not necessarily as an antagonist against China, but also together with China. Remember, President Xi Jinping at his press conference with President Obama talked about his Silk Road project and invited the United States to be a part of it. And the Silk Road has to do also with the Russia-China relations. I mean, why don't we, instead of seeing it as a a matter of a controversy, a contest. Why don't we see it as an area of cooperation in which the United States can cooperate with both? The Far East is important. There's also talk on the Russian side and also to some extent on the U.S. side of building this Bering Strait tunnel. Alaska and Chukotka could be the link that one would need. We'd have to develop Alaska. Wouldn't that be a better way of approaching this situation than trying to create a conflict that I don't think is going to happen anytime soon, and in order to change the situation entirely in the Far East?
Artyom, do you want
No,
to
we're-
quickly respond to that?
But I think we should
We can gather all the questions.
to
here. We're
gather-
gonna gather
okay.
all the questions here, and we're gonna give everyone the last chance here. So, right here, yes, Thomas.
My name's Thomas Grindley. In Soviet times, a constant thorn in Russo-Japanese relations was the Kuril Islands. But this seems to have receded into the background. Has this situation changed in any respect?
And do you see another hand? These two questions, and then we'll go back to the panelists. So here and then in the back. Short questions, please.
Good morning. My name is Veronica Cartier, and I apologize if my question is maybe already covered as I came late. But the issue that I would like to bring is of political culture and security. As I understand, Russia culture is with the Eastern European and the Balkan, and totally different than the Asian. And also the issue of security. So my question is, it is affiliated with your recommendation number 4, which is let the Asian do business with RFE. And that would be affected of the political culture. Decision making is that the culture will taking place. And I would like to bring that very strongly. And the second is the issue of security. How Russia deal with the latest technology of supersonic glide vehicle that China have invented in missiles, which is 8 times faster than sound. And how could Russia handle that?
Okay,
And
very good.
that's it. Thank you.
Take the last question in the back.
Thank you. Russia recently launched a large-scale railway upgrade or renovation project in North Korea, which will cost $2.5 billion. And Russia seems to think that South Korea's participation is key to the financing problem. And this railway can be connected to the Russian Far East Railway. And also there was a pilot project successfully done, bringing Russian coal through North Korean port all the way to South Korean port. So my question is, how big a role can South Korea play, do you think, in this picture, and how willing the United States will be watching this play it out? Thank you.
Okay, and I have one last question just to throw at both of you, and that is when you looked at Artyom's scenarios, 4 out of 5 of them were bad, and I'm just curious if is there a realization that as a result of what has occurred in Eastern Europe and in Ukraine, that resources have now been diverted from the Far East, and how is that playing kind of politically and socially in the Far East? So I'm going to let you wrap up and direct the questions as best you can. I know you can't answer all of them at the same time, as well as deal with Matthew's comments, but we'll give each a chance to wrap up and direct some of these issues. So shall we talk with
Okay,
Artyom.
let me start if Rance doesn't mind. Actually, first I'd like to respond to Matthew's remarks. Actually, I agree with most of your remarks, but with some of them I disagree. Yes, I believe that Russia's and China's interests, they very much converge right now and in the short term and mid-term run, but no one knows what happens in 20 years, in 25 years, in 30 years. It would be great if China remains even the way it is now. But what if China becomes increasingly nationalistic and expansionist? And as I said, if China gets Taiwan, if it gets the South China Sea, I think the next target could be the Russian Far East. And again, many Chinese, they very strongly believe that the Russian Far East is not actually Russia's, but China's. So I wouldn't exclude such a risk. There is really such a risk, and if there was no such a possibility, probably I would not be here today speaking like this. And responding to your remarks, actually agree with you completely. Cannot agree with you more. We should not pursue competition and rivalry being played out in the Russian Far East. We should aim for cooperation. China cannot and should not be excluded from the Russian Far East. And the US should not be be in a rivalry mode with China and the Russian Far East. Ideally, they should cooperate economically. The Russian Far East is such a huge area which needs so much investment that even China cannot do that. China could provide cash, the US could provide technology, Canada could provide expertise, and so on. So everyone has a niche, has a place in the Russian Far East. Question on the political culture, of course, you're absolutely right. Russia's culture, again, whether you like it or not, we are a European country. I've asked this question, by the way, repeatedly to my students, whether you identify yourself as Europeans, Eurasians, or Asians. Most of them tell me we are Europeans, of course. But I do think that differences in culture, they cannot block economic or strategic cooperation. Culture can largely be insulated from the issues of commerce or strategy. They are just different dimensions. Supersonic vehicle. Well, actually, I'm not a military expert, but I think the advanced weapons that China builds, they are currently not meant for Russia. They are meant for the US, of course. And I think that's obvious. That's obvious, at least for the next 10 years. Railroad project, yes, you're right. There is currently a railroad project ongoing between Russia and North Korea, with South Korea also being involved. And just last week, the first shipment of coal was delivered from the Russian Far East to the North Korean port of Rajin, and then was transshipped to the South Korean port. I think the degree of South Korean involvement in this, whether they will increase their involvement or not, will depend not only on Seoul, but it will also depend on Washington, because I think Seoul will make such big decisions after kind of consultation and getting advice from the US. So this is basically the question for Seoul and Washington to discuss. And finally, to your remark about the diversion of resources from the Russian Far East due to the mess in Eastern Europe, again, agree with you completely. We actually unfortunate to have this crisis, and there are already examples of projects in the Russian Far East being kind of cancelled or postponed indefinitely. For example, there was a plan to build a bridge to Yakutsk across the Lena River, but this plan was cancelled. And the people in Yakutia, of course, they're very unhappy about it. And of course, Russia doesn't currently have sufficient money to invest in the Russian Far East, also because of this crisis. Thank you.
Well, Archon's been remarkably efficient in getting to most of the questions, so Ren's,
I'm not going to
fi-
answer all
some
of
final
them. I mean,
thoughts.
I agree with everybody and everything. So. Yeah. No, I think on Matthew's point, I agree entirely. I mean, we've documented this in our book that Russia's pivot to China, long predated the sanctions. On the other hand, all of this has accelerated in 2013 and especially in 2014. And I think the problem now is that if you want to develop a strategy of engagement with the Russian Far East, Western engagement, it's kind of to balance China and to try to anyhow be a counterweight to Chinese influence in the region. It's kind of hard when you have this sanctions policy in place. That's my only comment. Otherwise, I agree with excellent comments. There's one other point. I think I spent about 5 days in Shanghai last April talking with the Shanghai Academy of Sciences about the Russian Far East, specifically about that. The Shanghai Academy, of course, follows that part of Russia very closely. And one of the things that came out of the meetings was general agreement that this is an area where China and Russia and the United States and Japan, other countries, could all cooperate together in building and developing the Russian Far East. Russian Far East, in other words, not just being an area, focal point of geopolitical competition and rivalry and conflict, here's an area where these countries could get together and cooperate, accomplish something good, meaningful, that would have positive implications for international relations in that whole part of the world. So I think I'll stop. Is that?
Well, that's great. I think we're out of time, so I would like to thank our speakers for just a very informative panel on a subject that doesn't get as much attention as it deserves. And I'm just very grateful for everyone's contributions today. Thank you for your questions,
Thank you.
and we look forward to seeing you at future. Wow, we actually finished on time. Wow, I did not see that.
No, me neither.
I feel extra better that I didn't. I let you give a great wrap up. That was really